There we go. My name's Belinda. I work for Sexual Wellbeing Aotearoa. I'm a health promotion specialist. And I'm sort of hosting this webinar today on behalf of Ragnar, who is also here. Hello. So a little bit of housekeeping is that if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat and then we'll do a bit of a Q&A at the end. If there's anything we can answer throughout in the chat, we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll have some time at the end to answer those questions, have a bit of a chat. I think that was the only housekeeping. It's about an hour today, so we'll aim to finish at 2:30. And yeah, there'll be some follow-up after as well. Oh, a few more people joining, so we'll just wait a second. There we go. All right, let me introduce Dr. Jessica Tappin. So works at Massey University, teaching in critical health psychology. A PhD research used feminist post-structural theory to examine the discursive landscape of women's sexual desire within media and psychological literature, including how taken for granted ideas shape women's opportunity for sexual subjectivity and agency. She is interested in how sociocultural norms, gender relations, and power shape experiences and meaning-making, drawing on feminist and critical approaches to understand health within its wider social and political context. Amazing. Can't wait to hear. So welcome, Jessica. I'll pass over to you. I'll check your PowerPoint work.
Yeah, cool. Good, Belinda. Thank you for that introduction. I'm just going to start my slide sharing. Which is the amount of times I do. Every time I go to share, I always forget how to, but bear with me. Okay, that should be popping up for everyone. Yeah, awesome. Okay, and awesome. All right, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko ingarangi te whakapaparanga mai, ko maharangi te whenua tupu, ko ototahi te kāinga, ko Jessica Tappin taku ingoa, tēnā tātou katoa. So kia ora everyone, my name is Jessica, or Jess. I work at Massey University, where I teach into the health psychology papers, as Belinda has mentioned. I live down in currently very freezing Otautahi, Christchurch, and I work remotely from there. So I'd like to say thank you to Ragnar and for Belinda for inviting me today to talk about this work. It's really awesome to be part of such an interesting and really important webinar series, so thanks for having me. So today I'm going to be sharing the findings from my PhD research, which I looked at representations of sexual desire and implications for sexual subjectivity and well-being. And I can also see that my supervisors, Sarah Riley and Tracy Morrison, are in the room. So thanks for being here, and apologies because you'll have heard this all many times before. So I hope it's not too boring for you. All right, so sexual desire and pleasure. I'll change my slide. There we go. Sexual desire and pleasure are really important parts of sexual well-being. So it's part of how we experience our sexual encounters and our relationships, but also how we understand ourselves as sexual subjects. So people who feel entitled to sexual pleasure and to sexual safety, and who make active sexual choices. So ideas about what counts as normal desire or normal pleasure and intimacy influence self-esteem, our sexual agency, and people's ability to make healthy and consensual sexual decisions. And at the same time, these ideas are not natural or fixed. They're socially and they're culturally produced. So where do people learn about sexual desire? So one place is relationships and sexuality education. So in Aotearoa, many educators and organisations advocate for really comprehensive sex ed that goes beyond just reproduction and risk, but includes topics like pleasure and consent and gender and communication, diversity and so forth. As you'll most likely be aware, RSC in Aotearoa is currently in a bit of a period of uncertainty, with curriculum guidelines being removed and new curriculum kind of still under development, which is in itself an interesting topic to look at. People also learn about sexuality through their families. through their peers and through broader social interactions. But another major influence is the media. So television, magazines, social media, influencers, TikTok, podcasts, we're all always constantly exposed to messages about our bodies, about relationships, how attractive we are or what attractiveness looks like, and sexual desire. So this mediascape plays a really powerful role in shaping cultural norms around sexuality and influencing how people come to think about themselves and think about others, and think about what sexual desire is supposed to look like. So there's a long history of feminist scholarship focusing on how we make sense of sex and sexual desire. I'm going to run through a few different ways of making sense of sex just to show the landscape in which this research operates in. And you might recognize some of these types of sense making from your own lives, from your own research, or your engagement with media. This list isn't exhaustive by any means. It's just some common framings of how we might talk about sex and desire. These framings aren't discrete, they intertwine and they influence each other, and they also shift over time. So as the social landscape around sex has shifted, the way that sex is portrayed in the media shifts and vice versa. So one way of making sense of desire is through a biological discourse. So this idea focuses on hormones, bodily functioning, evolutionary roles, and so forth, with little to no consideration of the socio-cultural context in which desire occurs. So this might look like how men are sometimes framed as biologically wired to be highly sexually driven. A woman is naturally less interested in sex. This framing primarily focuses on a heteronormative and genital-centric understanding of sexuality, and it reduces the complexity of human sexuality down to a biological functioning, where there's a correct way to experience desire, and that correct way is often linked to men's desire. The implication of this biological male sexual drive discourse is that men can be seen as unable to control their thoughts and behaviours. This can be unchangeable and not be held responsible for their actions. And in contrast, women are considered better able to exercise sexual restraint and so bear the responsibility of gatekeeping or granting permission for sex, rather than an active participant who also desires sex. Sometimes we see sexual desire being framed in relation to risk and responsibility. So we emphasize the danger associated with sex for women. Its logic kind of stems from that same male sexual drive discourse of men having an insatiable sex drive that they're unable to control, which then impacts the safety of women. Sex is framed as dangerous and something to negotiate in terms of keeping themselves safe, rather than something that's normal and can be safe, healthy, and pleasurable. And I suppose the importance there is recognizing that yes, women are at risk of sexual violence, but focusing on this without nuance removes agency from women and misses that sex can be pleasurable and important for well-being as well. Traditional discourses of sexuality position women as sexually passive, so framing good sex as something that's tied to commitments, marriage, and reproduction. So within this approach, women's sexuality might be seen as acceptable only within certain limits, like the idea that good sex happens within a relationship, but casual sex is not okay, or that women can express their desires, but discouraged from actively pursuing sex or at risk of being framed as promiscuous. We can also see the image of this empowered, sexy, openly desiring woman, a welcome change from the sexual subject to a sexual agent. But post-feminist critique of this like hyper-feminine sexuality argues that women are encouraged to become sexual adventurers, so to pursue pleasure, but in ways that align with this picture of ideal femininity, and ultimately end up centering male desire. So women might be told how to manage their bodies or perform confidence and become skilled in menology, so learning how to be sexy for men. Women's sexual empowerment is often framed in terms of confidence and self-knowledge and being in touch with their desires. But in practice, this often translates into body-focused behaviours and consumer-driven behaviours like buying lingerie or experimenting with new sexual techniques or reshaping the body to appear sexy and confident. So while desire is more visible, it's still heavily shaped by heteronormative regulatory scripts. Within mainstream media, queer desire is often made invisible or reduced to stereotype or portrayed for the heterosexual male gaze. And when queer desire does appear, it's often tokenistic rather than genuine representation. And often absent is an engagement with the intersection of desire and ethnicity or cultural practice, or a discussion of desire in very different bodies. And what you might notice is that the idea of women's agentic desire is kind of missing from these discourses. So this is a theme that's prevalent across lots of literature, and that it's just simply missing from social discourse, from sex education, from broader cultural narratives. And instead, women's desire is framed in relation to others. So typically men, leaving space for women to understand, leaving little space for women to understand or express their own sexual desire on their own terms. So overall, the media landscape is full of contradictions. On the surface, women might be portrayed as agentic and desiring, but on closer look, these representations frequently tether women's desire to male pleasure. And there's a real lack of representation of different sexuality and desire. So what I'm trying to get at with all of this is that our social understanding of sexual desire that is reflected in and supported by a very prevalent media landscape is pretty complicated, pretty contradictory, and really confusing. So this is the context in which my research took place. So I wanted to look at how is women's desire represented, and is there space for complicating or unlearning some of these ideas. So in general, I approached the research with a focus on power. So when institutions produce knowledge, they're not just describing reality, they're shaping what becomes accepted as truth. So media, psychology, medicine, and other cultural institutions all play a role in constructing these norms around gender and sexuality, shaping what kinds of desire are seen as normal, healthy, desirable, and so forth. And I became really interested in how these different texts speak to each other, so forming like a web of public discourse around sexual desire. And I suppose importantly, the mediascape is also really gendered. So in particular, it's women being told how to act, what to look like, how to attract men. So looking at this is really important, to seeing how these media depictions shape cultural expectations, so influencing how women are expected to feel and expected to behave. My research looked at 3 studies, how women's desire is constructed across 3 different textual formats. So I'm going to talk about the mainstream and the psychological literature first, and then I'm going to come back to the feminist media a little bit later on. So I wanted to look at, for this first part, I wanted to look at mainstream digital media. So the types of articles that women might come across in their daily internet use, so things like blogs or Substacks or online magazines and stuff that comes across your social media feed. So the way that I presented my analysis was through 3 subject positions that were made available across these texts. So subject positions are socially and culturally recognizable ways of thinking and feeling and speaking that people are invited to take up. So in my data, I found 3 different ways that women are told that they should be sexually desiring. The first one was called Made Through the Male Gaze. So what I found here was that sometimes women's desire was understood as related to and predicated on a man's desire for her. So in essence, women should be alluring and attractive to men, and men desiring them results in their own sexual desire. So in these extracts, I've kind of bolded a few points. So women need to experience being desired first before they can find sex appealing. The outcome of that is that women can view their own desire as something that happens to them rather than a feeling of embodied pleasure that originates in or from them. So viewing desire in this way also means that women need to find out how to attract or seduce men, to learn to regulate themselves to be appealing to men during sex. Women's desire was also linked to the result of penetrative sex rather than preceding it in that bottom extract there. So that subjectivity of an autonomous sexually desiring woman is pretty absent. and instead women can only think about their own pleasure as an outcome of being desired or kind of given to them by men. The next subject position was the working on it woman. So this is someone who recognises that having a high sex drive is important, both for themselves but also for their partner. But their sexual desire was kind of fluctuating and lower than acceptable. So, for example, women were able to go for a long time without feeling desire, whereas in contrast, men think about sex all the time. So desire was also constructed within the realm of disorder and dysfunction, so something for them to fix by seeing a doctor. So health was linked closely to functioning libido, presenting a moral obligation for women to make changes in order to be happy and healthy. But luckily for them, the data also presented a range of suggestions for this, like meditation or healthy eating or hormone therapy. So within the subject position, women can view their desire as a flawed but a redeemable aspect of themselves. The last subject position I talked to was the sexual connoisseur. So this describes a woman who is confident, who's outwardly sexy, tries new things, and is actively seeking her own pleasure. She can enjoy her sex life, she can learn new sex positions, she can try new toys, and she can be openly sexual. She consumes sex tips and advice and applies that knowledge in her own sex life. So, for instance, this article listed a range of ways for women to embody this agentic sexual connoisseur. So on the right-hand side here, a list of things to do. But in doing so also presents a kind of an obligation for women to keep sexy, to keep relevant, and to be exciting. The consequences of not doing so are to be left behind or labelled as boring or prudish. So embodying this position involves being skillful, but also fully taking up the subjectivity by getting in touch with your own desire and your own pleasures. So the emphasis on relationships and male partner sex here indicates that women were being encouraged to perform their identity to men for men's pleasure. So, for example, in that top extract, despite not really enjoying the position, being limber and being able to do these different positions is part of being good at sex, so women should do it anyway. And their own accidental pleasure is just an added bonus. So it seems quite empowered on the surface, but when we look deeper, women's desire is really secondary to men's desire. So these discourses and subject positions direct women towards a really particular understanding of sex and their own pleasure. So the language being used is that of empowerment, but really women are problematized because they need to increase their libido, they need to attract men, they need to learn how to be sexy and adventurous in order to please men. And so this is the mainstream mediated landscape in which women come to understand their sexuality. So next, I decided to look at psychological literature. So as I said earlier, I was interested in this idea of intertextuality. So how do various texts speak to each other? So we've all seen these types of headlines before, right? So scientists say this, experts reveal this, new study finds this. Media often refer back to scientific knowledge to lend credibility to their arguments, whether the arguments are accurate or not. Media often draw on psychological, oops, I think this is the wrong slide. Hang on. I changed slides too early, sorry. Media often draws on psychological experts to legitimize particular claims about sex and desire, and professional texts cite each other, so they reinforce dominant narratives by doing that. Psychology also isn't neutral. We're all researchers who are bound by the social conditions in which we exist. So dominant social discourse permeates the research that is designed, the questions that are asked, and the way that the findings are presented in research. Psychology also sits within what's called the psi complex. So this assemblage of institutions like academic research and clinical practice, the psychological language in popular media and books that bring these concepts and meanings into everyday social life. So we can understand psychological research and practice not as just observing and describing sexual desire, but also helping to define what counts as normal and healthy and excessive and dysfunctional, and so forth. So I made sense of the data through a framework of heterosexual gendered complementarity. So this is the idea that women and men are naturally different, they're opposite, they're complementary, they're designed to fit together. It relies on a really strong gender binary, where those categories are treated as fixed and biological and essential. So we see this in oppositions like rational versus emotional, or strong versus nurturing, or active versus passive. And biological reasoning gets used to make those differences feel inevitable and natural. Those traits are explained as just the way that men and women are. Men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Heterosexual sexuality becomes the default, the taken for granted norm within this framework. I didn't specifically use gendered language in the search terms when I was looking for this psychological literature, yet the results are mostly all gendered in this way, which says something about the kinds of normative reasoning and assumptions and what normal desire, that normal desire is cisgendered and heterosexual. So the main findings that I'm going to explain next are presented as different types of gendered differences, where men and women are positioned in complementary opposition to one another. So the first was sex drive differences. So here women were commonly portrayed as having a nominal sex drive, so comparatively lower than men's. This idea was normalized, so it was taken as a given, with the biological ideas of hormonal changes for women and men as having an innate sexual urge. And importantly, this was constructed as a problem. So women are positioned as most likely to be responsible for this problem. So as per the second quote, they're frustrated with themselves, and men are more likely to suffer because of the problem. So the men are frustrated with their female partners. There were also contextual differences between women's and men's sexual desire, with men being seen as stable and consistent, whereas women's desire was fluctuating and inconsistent. So this sets up a clear gendered binary. So women are emotional, they're relational, they're responsive, and men are physical, they're consistent, and they're driven. And there's very little critique present here as well. So these gendered patterns are just taken as natural. It really reinforces a kind of male standard for desire. So stability is ideal, and women's kind of more variable desire is framed as problematic, as a problematic deviation. And it also supports traditional gender roles, so positioning women's sexuality as secondary to their natural caregiving responsibilities. So overall, these constructions not only naturalize gender differences, but also align sexuality with broader heteronormative and patriarchal norms. I think I forgot to change the slide, sorry. That's better. So these are the extracts here. So this next one, motivational differences. So this is about how women's and men's sexual desire is constructed as motivated by different things. So motivated by emotions for women and by biological drive for men. So that idea of men want sex, women want love. That word emerge kind of suggests that women's, in the top quote there, suggests that women's desire isn't something they inherently have. It's just something that shows up once emotional conditions are right. So women are positioned as responsive to men and not desiring in their own right. And this contrasts with how men's desire is framed as a natural urge. Sexual activity for women can therefore be constructed as an expression of love and an act of service to their partners. And in contrast, men are excluded from these discourses of love and closeness and intimacy within sex. So you might have noticed that there are a lot of similarities between both of these data sets, and this makes sense given what I was talking about earlier about how texts refer to and they support each other. They reflect possibilities for how we can think about ourselves and our sexual desire. So both data sets, despite having a hopeful possibility of expanding norms of sexual desire, operate within a framework that reinforce really traditional gendered binaries. That idea that men and women are naturally different and therefore should think and they should feel and they should speak and behave in different ways as well. This also reinforces power dynamics where men's sexuality is positioned as the norm, so active, straightforward, expected, while women's desire is often framed as different or more complicated or even problematic. Desire is something that women need to work on was really interesting. So either in regard to increasing their libido or towards becoming sexually competent in a very particular way. So women need to think about their own desire in relation to men and to men's pleasure. And the data across both sites was also relentlessly heterosexual, so upholding a cis-heterosexual norm and narrowing what counts as acceptable or normal or healthy sexuality. I can't imagine that much of these ideas are hugely surprising or unfamiliar to everyone here. The kinds of messages weren't that unfamiliar. They weren't unfamiliar to me when I was doing this research. But I was surprised that it was still so prevalent in mainstream discourse. So it reminded me of stuff that I used to read in Cosmo in the mid-2000s. And I really wasn't expecting it to crop up quite so overtly in the early 2020s. I was also confused because I have read and engaged with a lot of online media that is sex positive and does talk about non-heterosexual desire and does frame up women's agency and women's sexual agency in an affirmative way. But that just didn't really come up when I was searching in the mainstream media spaces. And if we think about the way that content becomes popular online, it's connected to like algorithms and popularity and power dynamics where large corporations with big advertising budgets dictate what consumers see. So it makes sense that these smaller niche independent content writers like these ones on the screen here, Bitch Media, Bust, Salty, and lots of others, might not have necessarily had the same reach as a website like Cosmopolitan. So this is where I turned to next. So I wanted to look for those niche publications that describe themselves as feminist or as resistant to the status quo. So I've got a few descriptions here. So a feminist response to pop culture, telling the stories of people of colour from marginalised genders and promoting lesser heard voices and fighting for digital visibility. So these publications were all positioning themselves in that space as being actively resistant to those mainstream media discourses. So this third data set was comprised of texts from these independent and small scale publications. So on average, these publications received approximately 5 million monthly visits. So that might sound like a lot, but it's about 9 times less than the mainstream outlets that were included in my first data set. So I was interested in how these publications resisted those dominant discourses of desire, how they pushed back, and how they opened up possibilities for a broader way of understanding sexuality. So one of the patterns in this data set was that desire was constructed as diverse. So in contrast to mainstream media, these publications weren't presenting like a typical image of what desire should look like or who can be desiring. Instead, they centered like differences and they celebrated a wide range of sexual subjectivities, including like queer and asexual and disabled people. Many texts often also provided context about things like love and sex and relationships, but at the intersections of how that of gender and sexuality and culture and religion. which overall was a really marked contrast to the mainstream media, which typically portrays kind of young, able-bodied white woman's sexual desire. So in this first extract at the top here, this person talks about like literally stepping outside of taking for granted knowledges, so moving away, moving to college, and constructs community and people as being integral in them, kind of understand new things about their identity. So they describe the kind of normative environment that they grew up in as suffocating, and talked about detaching pleasure from kind of only heterosexual experiences. In the second extract, the author points towards how deeply ingrained normative ideas about sexuality are. So pointing towards how media often portray disabled people as lacking desire or asexual, and how the ubiquitousness of this discourse means that we're kind of conditioned to accept it as true. The third extract, this author talks about how dominant norms of sexuality that are portrayed in the media and that are reflected in society made them feel like they were broken. But they found validation in these alternative media spaces, and that helps them reclaim this kind of identity for themselves. So what I was taken by here is that in these texts, sexual desire doesn't look a certain way because it can be anything and everything. And I think another important point is that it's not simply that existing norms are kind of being expanded a little, or that difference is kind of added on to an otherwise stable understanding of sexuality and desire, but that diversity and difference themselves are becoming expected and normalized. So readers are encouraged to see sexuality as fluid and as individual. The second point is about the idea that we can understand desire and pleasure and passion as being individual pursuits, but also as rebellion and resistance to oppressive systems like racism and sexism and patriarchy and homophobia and ableism and so forth. So I saw this being reflected in these ideas around personal liberation and then also in community. So in these texts, people are describing themselves as becoming more comfortable with who they are, who they're attracted to, and how they express their sexuality, and that being part of a larger process of unlearning kind of harmful norms. So naming these oppressive structures like the patriarchy worked to allow them to move past or beyond that oppression that was holding them back. So pleasure wasn't just about feeling good, it was a political act, and personal experiences like dating or embracing their sexuality were framed as related to political liberation. So that idea that the personal is political. There was also the sense of collective effort. So articles talked about generational change and feeling proud to be part of a shift in attitudes towards sexuality. Pleasure and desire were seen as things worth reclaiming for yourself and for your wider community. So collectively, this alternative media really sits in quite stark opposition to the mainstream media and psychological texts. So alternative feminist media resists and negotiates these embedded norms about sexuality and desire, which open up pretty significant possibilities for how people can think about themselves and think about others. One thing I found really interesting was that lived experiences were really foregrounded, which was part of how these diverse stories of sexuality were able to be told. So people were the experts in their own lives and their own experiences, which meant that dominant structures like heteronormativity were able to be pushed aside when their experiences didn't align. But, you know, as you would have seen before in the mainstream media, the discourse was really expert driven. So others telling audiences how they should be and drawing on things like psychological literature or, you know, sex therapists or sexologists to kind of support the ways that they were talking about these norms and how people should be really prescriptive. Yeah, so these texts really purposefully push back against positioning women's desire in relation to attractiveness or pleasing others, which creates a lot of space for sexual agency and expanding understandings of sexuality beyond those kind of narrow ideals of femininity or heteronormativity. And when I practiced this, I talked way slower. So it turns out I'm actually coming to the end and we've got more time than I expected. But I always kind of find it difficult to end these things. Like, what's the take-home point? But I suppose what I wanted to point out is that acknowledging that it can be a bit depressing out there. Like, I know I absolutely feel it that we're living in a media space that's so saturated and it's all consuming with these constant messages about who we should be and how we should look and how we should act. And we have all these like increasingly personalized algorithms that shape what people see online, can be really harmful things like with the manosphere and general misogynistic content and the reimagining of outdated gender norms that are proliferating in particular spaces. But there are also opportunities for resistance and disruption. So there are people and there are influencers and there are organizations who are challenging these norms and producing more affirmative, inclusive, and agentic ways of understanding sexuality and desire. Unfortunately, they do sometimes lack reach. So large corporations dominate that media space. They have money, they have advertising budgets. So, if you aren't looking for these alternative feminist sites, these silos of feminist thinking, they can be submerged and kind of hidden away. So, for instance, 3 of the companies that I had included in this data set have since closed down since I've done this work because of financial difficulties. And we're seeing the same threads pop up, around funding and that kind of thing. So, part of what we can do is intentionally seek out and support and amplify those voices, pay attention to the types of discourses that we engage with, and take lessons from these sources in terms of the way that we talk about sex. We can radicalize our feeds a little bit and help create space where more expansive and empowering understandings of sexual desire can exist. And that's me. Early finishing, but any part I would welcome. And I think Saffron and Belinda have been looking at the chat. I haven't been able to see it if there are anything's popping up. I'll stop sharing my screen so that I can see everyone again. But thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. We didn't have any questions in the chat, but should we open up if anybody wants to ask a question? Can put your hand up or just unmute and ask. Or any thoughts about anything that Jess said? Ragnar?
Hi there. Hi, Jess. My name's Annabelle. How are you? Thank you for your
Good,
presentation.
Annabelle. Thank you so
I just
much.
wondered if you ever saw any like crossover, like what would it take for those sort of feminist alternative sources to end up in the mainstream? Like were there topics that did overlap or influences that did overlap, or is it pretty siloed?
I think there's definitely space for it. I think the stuff that comes up on the mainstream, like that's, if you are Googling, sex advice or whatever, the stuff that's coming up on the front page of Google is still really, I mean, not always, but I think in general that's still quite siloed. But I think there is definitely crossover, like particularly with Instagram. I mean, I obviously didn't look at Instagram for my research, but like there are people that are kind of looking at how there's less of a barrier to entry with things like Instagram and TikTok because you don't have to have huge advertising budgets to get a reach, whereas that's harder to do in mainstream kind of textual media spaces that you're kind of stuck if you're producing a little zine or, a small scale publication. There's not like a huge amount that you can do to push it out there. So I think there is crossover. I didn't really see that much, to be honest. There was some stuff that came up in the mainstream media sites that were like getting there in terms of being a little bit more feminist and like producing some more interesting ideas. But overall, like from the analysis perspective, they just weren't there enough for it to really like shine through. But yeah, which is disappointing. And that kind of is why I didn't intend to do the feminist stuff at first, but I looked at that mainstream media. I expected there to be way more crossover. And then I was doing the analysis and being like, are we living in the like early 2000s again? And so that's kind of why I decided to go in search of the other stuff. Yeah. I don't know how we can push. I think things like, as much as I don't want to be on like Instagram and TikTok, like there is like really cool opportunities in those spaces for people to reimagine and open up space, I think. But yeah, I hope that kind of answered your question a little bit.
Kia ora, Jessica. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I really appreciated the kind of like different ways that you looked at it and your analytic approach. I am wondering, kind of given the theme of the webinar series, if you sort of noticed any different representations of female desire across ages. So younger women, were they sort of often characterized as less desirous? I'm imagining, and maybe more, maybe older women as more, because I feel like there's this trope of the cougar, which I think has sort of calmed down in recent years, but so the ways in which female desire can become more problematized and sort of stigmatized almost in media.
Yeah,
like,
definitely.
you know,
It wasn't like
housewives, but that was early 2000s. Thanks.
Absolutely. It wasn't like a huge focus of my analysis. Maybe it should have been now that I look back. But I wonder if that's also because it wasn't super prevalent. Like there wasn't like a lot of difference. I do remember reading like a lot of kind of the more, I suppose, like Cosmo orientated, you know, if we think of like Cosmopolitan magazine, like those kind of texts were definitely much more focused on younger women. And in terms of especially like how to please your man and like how to be a good partner or whatever. And then they're just generally being less out there about like kind of older women's sexual desire, maybe just like not even a focus of the conversation. But yeah, that's kind of more anecdotal from my from just what I kind of read rather than like an analytic focus. But I think those tropes around like the cougar and then I suppose a young woman having to, you know, just enter adulthood and already know everything there is to know about sexuality or their own sexuality and, you know, things like that. That was definitely part of that sexual connoisseur one that I talked about, where it was about being like all knowing and all knowledgeable and really skillful and you know, able to please yourself and please your man, and those often were linked with it. Those were often seen in that kind of more young women, you know, women in their 20s and, you know, that kind of living their best life, that kind of vibe.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and they're like permitted to be sexual objects, you know, that's that sort of idea as well, I think.
Totally, yeah. And I suppose, moving away from that more closed off sexuality of like being teenagers and, you know, still having, you know, because there's lots of stuff around that, right? Like, you know, you're not 18 yet, or you're still in school, you know, you need to be, you know, in a particular way. So that was kind of more the you're in your early 20s and you can do what you want, and you can, you know, learn all you need to know about your sexuality and that kind of thing. But it would be an interesting approach to look. I'm sure there is stuff that does this, looks at, you know, across that lifespan as well. Yeah.
I found it really interesting, just like I've got all these thoughts swirling around, but around that idea that women are being sold this kind of empowerment idea, but underneath it, it's just for the desire of men. And I'm doing some work at the moment on like rough sex and strangulation and how it's kind of linked to, there's lots of nuances around, do women really want it? And is it something that they're being sold that they need to do for men? Because when you look at the differences with gender, it's most commonly done amongst men to women, and the women are the sort of ones being harmed. I just wonder, how does that all fit in? And especially with the government kind of removing the critical thinking out of the curriculum and it being harder to figure out what's true and what's not true. Just like, this is, it's a lot to like think about. Yeah,
absolutely. That exactly was that kind of sexual connoisseur kind of thing, right? It looks really feminist at first glance, and it looks like, women are and I suppose it's the thing, it's like it's the doesn't mean that women can't enjoy their own sexuality and be trying all the sex toys and excited about it, but it's that prescriptiveness, right, that like this is how you have to do this, and I suppose it's the same with your work as well, like this is part of what what this looks like, and if you don't want to do this, then I don't know, you're not good at sex, or I don't want to be your partner, all those kind of ideas. And and I think particularly your point about people thinking it's their own, thinking it's your own idea, like, oh, I have to want this because this is the way that it is to be a woman, or engaging in these relationships, and so kind of convincing yourself, and that's kind of what that literature looked like as well. It didn't look prescriptive on the outset, but underneath it really is, and it, I suppose, tricks people into thinking this is like a really feminist, like empowerment.
It makes me want to educate young people more. Just like, we need to get out there and do some more work on this, because it's so much more complex than this information is wrong or this is misinformation. There's actually like that agenda below it that we also need to kind of
absolutely.
I
think that's interesting, like how obviously not the removal of discussions of pleasure and sexuality in the sex ed curriculum, and the discussions of gender and gender norms and all that kind of thing. That's the implication of it, isn't it? Because if you don't have the ability to talk about pleasure and talk about these ideas as being as pleasure as being like a normal and a valid part of sexuality, if you're only talking about sex in terms of risks and reproduction, then you miss out on these conversations that we can have, that can, is a really nuanced idea, but it's really important that young people like actually understand that this is like valid for them to actually seek their own pleasure, rather than just being told what's pleasurable for men and go along with it.
So interesting, thank you. Did anyone else have any thoughts or questions?
Kia ora, Jessica. My name's Jo. I've used to work in sexual and reproductive health, but I'm just in reproductive health now, but still have a keen interest in it. Feels like desire is almost quite a subversive topic, doesn't it? It's the sort of thing that, particularly working in health as I do, we don't really go there. So I was interested, as a mother of two daughters, who it appears to me see their bodies as largely decorative, not things that they necessarily live inside and fully embody as strong, powerful, healthy young things who, anyway, so my thinking here, because I'm just listening in the office with all my colleagues, is that I was wondering whether you have any things that I could share with them for them to share with their cohort, because I'm constantly kind of trying to feministize the thinking of that lot there. And it's exciting stuff. So was this a doctoral thesis research or just a bit of research?
It was my doctoral thesis. There's I mean, there are so many cool like people talking about these ideas. I think that it's this is why I really like that feminist literature stuff, because I feel like that's where it all starts from, right? Like that kind of, well, at least it did for me, like reading all this stuff that really like started to click for me, and kind of radicalized myself through through reading all this stuff. So I did write a paper about the feminist literature stuff, and there's a list in there of all of the publications that I used. So I can put that in the chat if you want to have a look at the list, because there's some really cool ones that write like really accessible stuff about lots of different topics, not just sexuality, but like body image and just relationships and just general life and politics and things like that.
Nice.
But I would recommend, I mean, it's hard to tell someone to what they want to read and listen to, but yeah, I really think about, I think I said at the end, like radicalizing my feed, like going through on social media and just deleting or unfollowing all the people that I think are problematic, and following lots more that say really kind of cool stuff. And then we know when you're doom scrolling after work or or on the weekend, and you it's just like kind of like washing over you. And I feel like that really helps get these ideas in our heads. So I don't have any, I mean, I do have lots of, I'll have to look on my bookmarks to find the specific places I read, but I'll put that article in the chat because there is a list in there of those ones that might be useful. I don't know.
Sounds good. Thank you. I just also wanted to mention that in terms of cheering up, there's an Australian comedian who's just put something out called Inside the Femisphere, which is obviously flipping the Louis Theroux work. And I have to say, I was listening to it and thinking, this all sounds quite reasonable to me, you know?
I love that. Yeah, podcasts are a really good way of just getting those ideas in, and it makes you feel way less depressed about the state of the world as well.
Yeah, humour's great. Thanks.
So good. I just realized that might not be open access, but I'll put the link in anyway, and then I'll find the list now.
Do we have any last questions or thoughts to share? It's a really good discussion. Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Jessica, as well, Jess. I will, before we close, I'll just hand over back, before I hand over back to Saffron, the Ragnar will be sending out and following up after this. Jess had her email address in her PowerPoint, so yeah, if you want to contact her, then feel free. Sorry, is that okay?
Yeah, I was going to say, feel free to contact me. I can put it in the chat again, but it's
Cool.
if you can't reach that I don't know why it's working. Sorry, everyone. If you can't reach that article, or you want that list of text, just send me an email and I will send them to you. That's my email there.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I'll hand over to Saffron to close us.
Ka pai. I also just wanted to quickly mahi to you, Jess. Always interesting hearing about this kind of stuff, and especially as a young person myself, sort of really actively navigating this world as it's all happening and negotiating, wait, what's me, and then what's being fed to me, and what subject position am I taking up? So yeah, really cool. Ngā mihi. Ka pai. I'll close us off with a karakia. Also find it really quite heavy sometimes, holding all of this. So this karakia is all about, releasing that somewhat. Ka pai. Unihia atu ki te uri tapunui a tāne. Kia māma, kia wātea, te ngākau, te tinana, me te wairua ki te ara takatū. Koe ara e rongo, whakairihia, ki runga, kia wātea, aira, kua wātea, tihei, mauri ora. Ka pai. Tēnā tātou.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
See you.
Have a lovely afternoon. Bye.
Ka kite.
Bye.